happy hour. Thanks, Jen. And I'm going to spotlight our guest speaker here.
Hi, everyone. Happy to be here.
So good morning, everyone. My name is Shweta Arya. I'm with Delaware Interfaith Power and Light. And we are so excited to have you here for RASCL's coffee hour, quarterly coffee hour. And Delaware Interfaith Power and Light is very excited to co-host this one. I know we all are aware of climate change, and we know climate change is the biggest threat to our public health, the global economy. And according to IPCC report, the next 10 years will be the most crucial for us to take action. Climate change exacerbates excessive heat, wildfires, droughts, flooding. So what is the best strategy for us to tackle this climate crisis so we can really make our communities resilient for it, to tackle it now and for the future? And thinking about all this, I think maybe multi-solving is the best approach to go. So we're really excited to have this talk from Dr. Elizabeth Sawin. So now I will introduce our guest speaker. Dr. Elizabeth Sawin is the co-founder and co-director of Climate Interactive. Beth is an expert on solutions that addresses climate change while also improving health, well-being, equity, and economic vitality. And she is the originator of the term multi-solving to describe such win-win-win situation. So I would now like to welcome Dr. Sawin. Take it away, please.
Thank you so much, Shweta, and thank you everyone for your attention. I know you could go to probably 100 Zoom calls a day, so it means a lot that you chose to have this time together. I'm gonna share my screen, share some slides with you. Just give me a second. I'm not seeing them right away. I think I know the problem. Just give me one sec.
Do you want me to share the file with you guys?
No, it's that I had it in presenter mode and Zoom wasn't recognizing it as a window. But hopefully now, now you see it?
Yes.
Now we can do it like this. Yeah, so here we go. The way we're going to work today is a few remarks from me, just introducing the idea of multi-solving, and then we'll have a quick interactive exercise that we think will be fun. Then we'll have time in breakout groups for you all to meet each other and talk about multi-solving in your work. And we'll come back together for just a second or two, minute or two, and then close. So I want to start by talking about converging crises, which is a word I find myself writing about and talking about a lot these days. And here are just a few examples of what I mean by that. And I think you'll probably recognize this everywhere. In April 2020, just as the COVID-19 pandemic was, hitting around the world, in the South Pacific, countries were getting ready to lock down for COVID-19, and people were trying to move around and get to wherever they wanted to be for lockdown when a tropical cyclone made stronger by warm ocean waters as a result of climate change hit at the same time. And tragically, many people lost their lives in ferries and boats that were trying to move between islands. And then in the aftermath of that, places like Fiji had to figure out how to shelter people who'd lost their homes in the cyclone while keeping them socially distanced and safe from climate change. So there's two things hitting at once, converging crises, global pandemic and global climate change. Think about in this country, in the West, we're watching heat and fires right now. You all remember Last year, I'm sure the utility in California, PG&E, that shut off power to prevent forest fires under really dangerous conditions, but that left many people without electricity. People who could least afford it lost the food in their freezer. It impacted small businesses. So there you have climate change intersecting with economic equity, economic vitality, and economic equity. We know that people from marginalized groups feel the effects of climate change the most. For instance, the urban heat island effect is most pronounced in places that have people of color populations or low income communities. The impacts of air pollution, which of course come from fossil fuels, is felt most strongly by people of color, even though they, in their economic activity, create less air pollution. So we have this intersection of equity, climate change, health, other threats. And that's the landscape that we're having to navigate. And it's becoming, you know, more and more and more intense. I think you just have to look at the headlines or sometimes your own experience to have that feeling. And this converging nature of the crises and the urgency of them creates a bunch of failure modes that are really, you know, we can't afford failure on these issues. And yet here are some of the obstacles that I think we face. We face the possibility our responses are too slow or too small, which means there's too much pushback to change. So ambitious policy to address any of these crises often gets stalled or watered down. Actions on climate are often framed as being too expensive. There's the potential that we can't sustain the momentum. We know that this transformation to a low carbon economy is going to take decades. How do political leaders continue to push for that, even when in a problem like climate change, success actually looks like things getting worse more slowly than they otherwise would? That's a hard proposition for a political leader to continue to motivate people. Then we have cases where one solution makes other problems worse. In China, they had an economic slowdown at the beginning of their lockdown, and their response to it was to relax environmental controls, which led to more air pollution and more fossil fuel greenhouse gas pollution. Or think of the cases where failing to address one of these converging crises means that gains on another problem are just eroded. Here, I think a good example is, think of all the small local businesses we as individuals have tried to support to get through the pandemic. We've spent billions as a government with aid packages to help those businesses. In the next few years, how many of those are going to be slammed by fires or storm surges or floods, right? So we invest a lot and we solve one problem, but it's all precarious if we haven't addressed the other converging problems. So as someone who's worked in this space now for more than 20 years, that's just a little glimpse into my brain of how I see our situation. And the good news, and I really want to spend most of this hour on the good news, is that I think there's a lot we can do, even though these problems are individually challenging. And that's because some of them get easier to solve when we put them together. And that's the heart of the idea behind multi-solving, which at Climate Interactive we define as finding solutions rooted in justice that provide co-benefits in health and resilience and well-being, while also protecting the climate. Multi-solving gets easier to understand when you get specific about it. So here's just one very simple example of multi-solving, where one action leads to multiple solutions. Every time a place turns off a coal-fired power plant, that improves health, but at the same time, it also protects the climate. So it reduces things like PM 2.5, small particles that impact people's health via air pollution in the short term, in just a matter of days. And then over a time scale, more like decades, shows up as climate protection. So that's a simple kind of classic example of multi-solving. This graph, which is a full life cycle accounting of the cost of coal in the US, And this is a paper from the late Paul Epstein and his colleagues. And they broke down all the ways that coal costs us as a society. And the biggest wedge at the bottom of that pie is air pollution and all the health impacts, which lead to things like cardiovascular disease and respiratory illness and premature birth. Then there's the impacts on the public health of people in the regions where coal is extracted, and some other miscellaneous impacts like mercury released by coal. So all of those blue and gray wedges is a majority of the piece of pie when you look at all the impacts of coal. The climate impacts are that orange wedge. And yet I think about, my own work in the climate movement, less so now, but certainly 10 or 15 years ago, we were focused just on that orange wedge of pie. We were talking about the long-term climate impacts and trying to make the case to do something about it, and kind of missing the fact that there were a lot of other impacts and therefore a lot of other constituencies who could be aligned with us in this effort to address climate change. This is more and more well known now. The World Health Organization in 2018 came out with an important study where they found that the health benefits of getting on the path to meet the Paris Agreement goals, those health benefits were actually of the same value financially as the costs of the energy system changes to be on that path. We know this not only from forward-looking studies like the World Health Organization, but also from looking at retrospectively. So in the US with the boom of wind and solar, a paper in Nature a couple years ago looked at the health versus climate benefits of what we've already done. And in fact, that boom in renewable energy, you could argue was more of a health program than a climate program when you look at the value of the benefits. So back to this slide about the potential failure modes. I want to try and sort of paint the picture of where multi-solving comes into that. So the failure modes that we talk about in terms of things being too slow or too small, or there's too much pushback to change. Now think about the wedge of pie, for instance, around the coal-fired power plants. If the climate movement alone doesn't have the force for the political wins that we need to make or to drive the pace of change, well, think of the allies that we have in the fields of public health. Think of all the budgets and foundations and movements and citizens. If we can figure out how to be sure whenever we're talking about climate policy that we're also talking about health policy. On this issue of the hardships of sustaining momentum, here also multi-solving helps because it ties together the short term and the long term. While climate change may look like things getting worse more slowly than they otherwise would, for air pollution and health and jobs, those are immediate benefits that are all really on the plus side. And by taking a multi-solving approach, when we're focusing on different topics all at the same time, we avoid or we at least reduce the risk of one solution making other problems worse, or failing to address key issues. So for all of those reasons, we think multi-solving is really, such a promising way of approaching climate change that we really can't afford to stay in that narrow climate-focused silo. The best way to give you a sense of the potential, I think, is to share some examples of what multi-solving looks like. And so the examples I'm going to show come from case studies that we've created at Climate Interactive. And that reminds me to do something I forgot to do at the beginning, which was to introduce my colleague who's also on this call, Cassandra Ceballos, and she'll wave or something so you can maybe see her. We'll make sure she unmutes at some point and you can, she can help answer questions that come up, and she's gonna help with the interactive exercise that we'll do. So here are a few examples of multi-solving. This one is a project from South Carolina, and the Nature Conservancy was the leader in this project. And its focus was to help with restoration of oyster beds, and it had a goal of alleviating flooding, preventing erosion, restoring marine habitats. So it's building climate resilience to flooding while also protecting biodiversity and protecting the economic vitality of that region and its dependence on fisheries as a source of income. So there you see co-benefits in ecosystem restoration and protection of people and communities. Multisolving we've found in every place we've looked, in every continent, every culture. This is an example that started in Colombia called Ciclovia, and this model has been copied around the world. Some of you may even know in places, have been in places that have borrowed this idea. Essentially what they do almost every weekend and on holidays in cities in Colombia is to turn off, to limit access to motor vehicles. And so the streets become open for families and children, for biking and roller skating. And this is at once a community building intervention, a health intervention, for the communities where these highways go through, a nice break from air pollution and noise pollution. And the health benefits of this have been studied in the way that they get people physically active, and those offset, it turns out, the costs of setting up and maintaining a program like this. Another program that we looked at is called Walk to School, and it happens now in many cities in the United Kingdom. It was a response to what was perceived as an emergency in children with a lack of physical activity. And so it was a program that worked with families, teachers, the medical community, city planners to create safe routes for children to walk to school. I'm going to just stop for 1 second because I have a little issue here. Cassandra, could you please Slack Phil and tell him I think the dog is loose and trying to get in the house?
Sure.
Thanks. There's this, for everyone else, you maybe get a smile, some enormous scratching outside my office door. So there's either a bear trying to get in or our dog let herself out and is trying to get back in.
And you know, Beth, as soon as you say that, my cat jumps on my desk and I was going to have to.
Yeah, so the world of Zoom, we're all coping with our pets. So one thing about the Walk to School program is it was pretty carefully studied for its health benefits. And they came to a ratio of something like 6 to 1. So for every dollar invested in helping children walk to school, there were $6 worth of benefits. And that was things like the improved health and social well-being of children, less traffic congestion, families spending less money on vehicles, the reduced costs of air pollution, and of course, the reduced greenhouse gas emissions from transportation. So one thing you'll see is that these are really often simple innovations, right? And they are within the power of our communities to do. And so sometimes in the face of a global problem, it can be paralyzing to people. And one of the things I love about Multisolving is its effectiveness or its accessibility at all different scales. And we see it from this very local, the neighborhood around a school, all the way to state, national, and regional projects. One last example, one of my favorites, also was a response to a crisis. And this is another theme we see in Multisolving. So I mentioned the Walk to School. The crisis was children not getting adequate physical activity. This Green Curtains project in Japan was a response to the energy crisis after the Fukushima disaster in Japan, when they turned off their nuclear electricity generation. That created an energy crisis. There was an effort across the country to reduce energy needs. And one of those responses came from factories that instituted this project called Green Curtains. And so these are just vegetative curtains outside of buildings that keep them cool. So it reduces the need for air conditioning and the need for energy that comes from air conditioning. And in many places, the crops that they planted in these walls of vines were actually produced fruits and vegetables that were then inputs into the company cafeterias, or employees were able to take the food home to their families. This started in a few factories and now has, our understanding is, been replicated pretty widely across Japan. So there you have, you're saving money on energy, you're reducing energy needs, you're reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the building sector, and you're producing healthy, nutritious food that just enriches people's diets, and potentially saves money again to the for the factory or for the employees. This is a pretty fast tour through Multisolving, and we'll share afterwards a lot of resources on our website where you can find more about all of these case studies. But I want to emphasize one of the things that stands out across so many of these cases, and that is that equity, and I mean equity in all sorts, gender equity, economic equity, racial equity, is both an outcome and a process of multisolving, and part of the process of multisolving. So it's an outcome in the sense that with good design, these multiple benefits that we've been talking about can be targeted towards groups that have been traditionally disenfranchised, left out of decision-making, marginalized in some way. So that looks like, a clean energy project that produces jobs and that has a job training program for people of color or for young people in need of employment. It looks like energy efficiency programs that target people who live in housing that's substandard and producing health impacts on them. It looks like reducing the energy burden, which is the percent of someone's income that they spend on their utility bills. So multisolving can be designed to make our societies more equitable. And I don't think I need to make the case for that. I think in the US, the impacts of structural racism and other types of inequity are so clear. We know that we have to simultaneously address climate change and create a more equitable society. And the silver lining is, if we have to redesign so much of our world to reduce emissions, that by using multisolving, we can do that in a way that boosts equity. So that's the way in which equity can be an outcome. When I say equity is part of the process, what I want to emphasize is that you can't multisolve, you can't capture all of these co-benefits without attention to equity and how you work together, right? Multisolving projects are highly cross-sectoral. They often involve people with formal power like government entities and people with informal power like neighborhood associations. Without explicit attention towards power sharing, toward conversations about race and gender and justice and economic equity, you really can't have the type of trusting relationships and collaboration you need to pull off multisolving projects. So equity is something that you can get via multisolving, but you're unlikely to get it unless you're also attending to equity in how you work. Equity doesn't happen by accident. I'm sure many of you see this and account for it in your own work. Things that we've seen in the projects we've been involved in, we'd encourage conversations about equity just as much as conversations about climate or water or oysters or whatever it is that your project is focused on. It really asks for an attention to barriers to participation. If you want working people to be involved in your multisolving, are you holding your meetings, in the evening with childcare and food? That would be a way to reduce a barrier to participation. Or what language are you using? Do you have a way to reach people who may not have internet connectivity, and so on? And then I just can't emphasize enough that multisolving requires attention all the way down to actually sharing resources and power. This isn't about lip service. It's about changing how both power and money are used and how they flow. And in your project design, it's really important to always have this attention on who's making the decisions. Do they represent the impacted communities? Where are the benefits targeted? And if there are burdens that emerge, whether those are costs or pollution or traffic, whatever it is, what communities are bearing those burdens, and are they being equitably shared? Something you hear a lot or you see on posters at rallies is no decisions about us without us. So if you needed a little tagline to think about your own multi-solving efforts, that's something we'd offer being really worth some thought. One thing that has been fascinating for us as we look across different multi-solving examples, and like I said, we see them at all scales in all sectors around the world, but amongst all that difference, we see some common principles about not the what of these projects, but the way that they're carried out. We see that multi-solvers are really committed to this idea that everyone matters, everyone is needed. We see this idea that sometimes it's easier to make progress on problems by putting them together. In our culture here in the US and in the West, there's this reductionistic, we try to solve problems by making them smaller, biting off a bite-sized piece, we say. Multi-solving is the opposite of that. It says, maybe if we put some problems together, we'll have more power, creativity, money, votes to address them. And the other thing we see is that these multi-solving projects are often very iterative. They usually start small and they grow from learning and storytelling. So the three things that we see that really drive a multi-solving project from small to significant or more significant is the way that they welcome new participants across different structures, a really high attention to documenting the impacts. Many of the examples that we looked at in some way create baselines and then really do document, this much money saved on energy bills, this many fewer visits to the emergency room with asthma, and so on. And turning that documentation into stories. Not everyone can see the potential of multi-solving at first. It's often innovative, visionary people who start, and the way that others find their place is by being attracted to the stories of what's possible. So I wrote a bit more about this in an article in the Stanford Social Innovation Review a couple years ago. It's a good short piece on what I'm saying here. If that catches your eye, we'll share that article as well. So we are throwing a lot of information at you, and we have just one more piece of explaining and then a short exercise, then time for questions and breakout groups. So bear with me for just one more bit. This is a tool that we developed to try to help people have conversations about multi-solving. And we call it Flower. And it's really just a way to think creatively about the potential multiple benefits of any project that you do. Flower stands for the Framework for Long-Term Whole System Equity-Based Reflection. It's an activity with actually paper and colored pencils. You can see these kids doing that. I think that's a classroom in France somewhere. But we're going to try, since we're not in one room with colored pencils, we're going to try an online way to do it. But first, I'll just name what the petals are. So in the center is climate protection, the long-term benefit. So if you were doing a project and you thought it was going to reduce emissions, and you had a blue colored pencil, you'd shade that in the center. And then you'd ask, what else might improve by virtue of this project that I'm undertaking? Are people going to have access to food security or cleaner water or something about nature? That would go in that top green petal. Is this going to create jobs or assets for the community? Then you'd shade in that petal. How about health, well-being, and safety? People going to have cleaner air, or somehow their community going to be safer? This bottom petal is about a sense of connection. Often we hear about community cohesion as such an important element, particularly of climate resilience. Do we know our neighbors? Are we looking out for each other? Energy, mobility, and industry. This is a big category. This is access to energy around the world. Not everyone has access to energy. This is about the industrial sector and about mobility. Mobility is one of a key drivers for escaping from poverty. Are you able to get to work, school, and healthcare? And is that affordable? Do you have to have a car? So on. All those considerations go in that orange petal. And then resilience. Is this action somehow making communities better able to withstand or prevent things like floods, fires, droughts, and heat waves. So that was a quick run through. I think Cassandra is going to be able to put the same diagram in the chat, and then you can also find it on our website. What we want to try to do is give you two examples, and because we don't have this paper and pencil exercise, we're going to try an online way where we can sort of each vote, like which of these co-benefits do we think a particular case study might produce. And in that way, we'll get almost like a crowdsourced map of what a flower diagram might look like. So where the original incarnation of this exercise, these school kids, if they thought, oh, well, this will improve resilience, they'd get their yellow pencil and they'd color in the resilience petal. Instead, we're going to give you a way to mark the diagram, and we'll see what you all think. And one thing I would say about this diagram, the blanks and everything for it are on our website. Maybe you'd have fun using it with your communities. It's not a right or wrong type of exercise. It's a piece to spur conversation. And the questions we really like to see people asking are, is there any way we could change our project design to get more co-benefits? What if we added green space to our bike lane proposal, or so on? So it's meant to help spur creativity. And also, we won't have time to really go in depth on this today, but for each petal, you can ask, are we doing this in the most equitable way? Are the benefits of this petal being shared equitably? What might we need to do to make that more possible? So here's how this is going to work. It's a bit of an experiment for us, and we'll hope you'll play along. So Cassandra will put this URL in the chat, and you should copy it. And that's going to take you to a place where you will see the flower diagram, and you'll be able to click on whatever petals you think are potential benefits of a couple cases that we'll look at together. The other thing we need to do to make this work is I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and Cassandra will share hers. We're going to give you a chance to practice, and then we're going to do it on 2 actual cases. So here goes. I'll stop sharing.
Yes, and I just shared the link to the poll. So now, if folks can go to that link that I shared and just kind of practice, enter in your name, I believe, and then just, make sure you've got kind of.
So what you're seeing is every time one of you clicks on that screen, you're making these little green teardrops. And it looks like it's working.
Each person, respondent is able to add 6 teardrops because there's 6 petals. So, if we show a case study that has all the petals are relevant, you're able to do teardrops, but 6 teardrops. But if we have a case study that maybe a petal isn't relevant, you don't have to add all 6. You can stop it where you feel comfortable.
All right, so it looks like it's working. So Cassandra's going to clear off your test. They're gone. And then if you can put the slide for the first case study. So this is another case study. This is one Cassandra researched. It's based in Baltimore. And it was a project in a neighborhood that was known for a couple challenges. One was food security and challenges accessing fresh fruits and vegetables, especially. It was also an area with challenges in both the urban heat island effect and stormwater issues. So these are both things that are, of course, exacerbated by not having a lot of tree cover. So it was a project led by many community groups coming together to plant fruit and nut trees in clusters of orchards. And you can see it produced really a significant amount, more than 25,000 pounds of produce. It also taught people skills that were potentially employable in landscaping, farming, and tree care. Cassandra, is there anything else you would say about the Baltimore Orchard Project?
I would say that it wasn't just that one area. These were orchards all around the city of Baltimore, and they specifically tried to plant them in areas that had the highest rates of food deserts or healthy food priority areas. In addition to community groups coming together, there was government involvement. So the Office of the Mayor helped, as well as Tree Baltimore supplied all the trees for free. It's kind of a group of the Office of Sustainability. And what they did was they planted the orchards in churches, around congregations, schools, and community centers. And so they worked with the people in the neighborhoods to design something that fit the space and needs. It wasn't just cookie cutter. So it was really about working with the people that they were trying to help.
Awesome. So that's a snapshot of the Baltimore Orchard Project. So now go back to the flower and looks like people are already.
Yeah, let's start now.
Okay, so go ahead and put what benefits you could imagine. And Shweta, I saw in the chat, you're right, we're gonna move to the breakout groups real quick. So I think we're on track. So look at those dots coming in. And one thing that's pretty cool is to notice that they're covering that flower pretty broadly. Like people are saying, yes, food, water, resilience, jobs, health, sense of connection. Maybe not quite so many dots on energy, industry, and mobility. And yeah, I would probably agree with that. Like not every multi-solving project will hit every benefit. But we sort of have a consensus here of like lots of benefits.
I would add that I think in this scenario, we decided it could be energy and industry and mobility because reducing urban heat island effect means that they stay cooler in the summer homes, and so they use less electricity. And during the winter, the trees help, add a barrier against cold wind and air.
Nice. Excellent. So we're going to do, now that you got the hang of it, one more quick case study, and then we'll move to the breakout groups. So this is a project from Nashville. It was a weatherization project sponsored in part by a electric utility, offered weatherization for low-income homeowners, reduced people's energy utility bills, improved quality of life. Lots of these home energy projects that we've studied reduce people's, particularly people with respiratory issues, their indoor air quality improves a lot. And they managed to retrofit 200 homes in the first year of this pilot. So you guys have got the hang of it. Let's just think about weatherizing homes for low-income homeowners. And let's go back to vote one more time and see what that looks like.
Yes, I'm trying, sorry. Okay, there we go.
All right. So resilience, right? Because a well-insulated home is going to stay cool longer if the power goes out, for instance. Jobs, right? Think about the people doing that work. Health, well-being, and safety. Yep, those homes are, those are just better for the health of the occupants. Definitely saving energy and sense of connection. Any community project, right, is an excuse for community building, or not an excuse, has an outcome of community building. Great. So I hope that kind of gives you a little bit of a taste of flower. And it's available. Yeah, it's available on our website. So go check it out and use it for your purposes. I've got the questions for the breakout. So I got to find my PowerPoint again. Oh, same problem we had before, I bet. Sorry, everybody.
Next slide was just asking people if they had any questions for us, but I guess we're gonna go to break.
I think we don't have time for that. Cassandra, can you just share yours again and show the breakout questions? I somehow don't have this option.
I need to find it too. Okay.
Thank you. Okay, so Shweta is going to be the mastermind of this, and then Cassandra and I and folks from RASCL and Interfaith Power and Light are each going to be in a breakout group. We have I guess about 20 minutes, maybe more like 15 at this point, Shweta.
Yeah.
So yeah, does that sound right? 15. So we'll just introduce yourself since we don't all know each other. And then we just a chance to say, what's a takeaway from the morning? And are you applying a multi-solving approach in your work, or where do you see that you could be? So we can learn from each other. So pretty simple.
All right. Sounds good. Thank you so much, Dr. Sawin. That was a great presentation, and I loved the exercise at the end, which really put it together. And I'm sure people can visit the website and you know, really check it out in detail. So now I'm going to send everyone in different breakout groups, and we can really talk to each other and discuss. And I think that will be a fruitful exercise as well. So here you go. Hang in there. I'm going to move you to a different room. Oh my God, I don't know. Sorry, Peggy. Peggy and Stephen, hold on tight, and I will try to move you guys to a different room. Move to 2. Move to 2. Stephen, can you accept my invitation when I move you? Stephen? Great. How did it go? Oh, you're muted.
It was good. I didn't mean to click and come back. My friends are probably still talking, but
yeah, and I said, because I thought that this would, as you were leaving, I was thinking this could be a good opportunity to mention En-ROADS. But so maybe we'll wait until people are back and I know we kind of don't have much time now, but.
Hi, Maggie.
Hi, Shweta. Sorry, I was like, where's my mute so I can come off?
Shweta, do you want to just close us? It's really only a couple of minutes. I mean, we're happy to take questions.
Yes, we just have a few minutes, so maybe we can open the floor if we have any questions. I don't know if we'll have time for any elaborate ones, but if somebody has any quick question to ask, Dr. Sawin, this is your time to do that.
Yeah, or also any insights that came out of your small groups that you'd like to share would be great too.
Right. If any of the facilitators want to share something, just unmute yourself and share a couple of highlights from the room. That'll be great.
I'll go ahead and start on that, Shweta, if I may. We, aside from myself, we had an all DENREC group here. But what really came out of that was the opportunity to find other partners who share similar goals on that, looking for co-benefits as we do that as well. The folks here are already thinking outside of the box, but this just amplified more, especially with that flower diagram, more ways of being able to see where we have other opportunities to expand the work that we're doing or to help other people.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, John. Daniel has shared a great point there. Multi-solving can be a help to being more competitive for grant funding, which is really a good point. Anybody else? Jennifer?
Yeah, so our group was, it was great. We had different viewpoints and we also had some networking going on. So that was really helpful. And it was great to be able to connect some people. We were talking also about the importance of planning for indirect and cumulative impacts, and that was being discussed a lot. And of course, we had different representation from geographic locations, but very similar in proximity and how, from a county aspect to a municipal aspect, and also how those integrate, and not just looking at one parcel, but looking at a larger, a county as a whole or a state as a whole, and looking at those cumulative and indirect impacts.
Thanks, Jen. Dr. Sawin, would you like to share a few things maybe from your group, and then we can close out our webinar, our coffee hour.
Yeah, well, I enjoyed our group. A lot of the solutions we were talking about were at the intersection of water and communities. And I would say around the country, that seems to be a really common place for multi-solving. Green infrastructure, is what many people refer to it as. And there's just so many benefits that come from, some people now say softening a city, tearing up impermeable surface, planting trees and rain gardens. The literature is really just beginning on the mental health benefits of people living in green space, but I think that in the next few years is really going to become compelling. But that highlights, we were also talking about the Walk to School program, and it highlights maybe one last thought I'll leave you with about multi-solving, which is that because there's so many benefits and so many areas of expertise required, it really calls for a different sort of leader. Some of us, I think, were trained to be experts in our field and most comfortable. I'm an engineer, I'm a transportation planner, I'm a public health expert. But to pull off these projects and really get the benefits, if I'm trained in transportation, I might not have studied mental health and green space. and I don't have to, but what I do have to do is probably leave my office, my community, maybe my organization, to forge relationships with someone who does know about that. And a lot of times in just our job descriptions, the hours we have in the day, that's one of the biggest obstacles. So if any of you are setting budgets or directing teams and you have space to give people the opportunity to make these sort of branching out relationships, and if you treat that as part of your jobs, that's one of the conditions for multi-solving to really blossom. So I'll leave you with that as another intervention point to address these converging crises. And beyond that, just thanks so much for having us. We'll follow up with some links and our emails. If you'd like to be in touch, please do.
Thank you so
Elizabeth.
much. Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for the RASCL Coffee Hour. We are going to announce the date soon for our annual summit. It will be sometime in December. So please look out for the date. And again, thank you, Dr. Sawin, for sharing a wonderful presentation with us. And you guys have a great day.
You're welcome. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.